A teenager's false confession unravels a 15-year cover-up by local police, until a stranger starts asking questions nobody wants answered. If our stories excite you, subscribe to put the notification on for more interesting episodes. Alder Creek was the kind of place where nothing big ever happened, until something did. On a cold October night, the streets were unusually quiet. The town's only grocery store had just closed. The last customers were gone. Street lights flickered like tired eyes struggling to stay awake. A gentle fog crawled in from the nearby woods, blanketing everything in a soft haze. At 10:47 p.m., a scream cut through the silence. It came from Morales Market, a small corner store owned by a beloved man in the neighborhood, Hector Morales, 58, kind, hardworking, and known for slipping free candy to kids when their parents weren't looking. Seconds after the scream, a motion sensor triggered the store's alarm. By the time police arrived 7 minutes later, Hector Morales was dead. He had been stabbed once, clean, precise. The cash register drawer was open but untouched. There was no forced entry. Nothing stolen. No fingerprints, no witnesses. But outside, crouched near the side alley behind the store, was Jamal Evans. He was 16. Black. Quiet. A junior at Alder Creek High. He had no prior record. No history of violence. No reason to be there, except for one simple thing. He dropped his phone. Earlier that night, Jamal had taken his usual shortcut home through the alley behind Morales Market. He walked that route often after basketball practice. His mom always told him to stick to the main road, but Jamal liked the quiet path. It cut 10 minutes off his walk and gave him a break from the teasing he got from other kids about his stutter. As he passed the store, he heard something, a thud. Then a gasp. Curious, he stepped closer. That's when he saw a man running out the back door. Jamal ducked instinctively, hiding behind a dumpster. He peeked out, heart hammering, and watched the man disappear into the fog. He wanted to call for help. He pulled out his phone, then dropped it when a shadow moved behind him. The sirens came fast after that. Flashing lights. Commands barked through megaphones. Guns drawn. A spotlight on his face. And then hands, rough and urgent, pushing him to the ground. He tried to explain, but his words came out slow, nervous, and stuttered. They didn't listen. They found his phone near the back door. His fingerprints on the dumpster. And they didn't look for anyone else. Inside the station, Jamal sat alone in the gray interrogation room, knees bouncing, hands trembling. His jacket was soaked. His left cheek stung from where he'd been pressed to the pavement. It smelled like bleach and metal and something sour. 2 detectives entered, Detective Cole, mid-40s, thin-lipped, gruff, and Detective Rhodes, younger, quieter, eyes watchful like a hunter. "Let's talk," Cole said. "Make this easy on yourself." Jamal looked up, scared. I didn't." "We know," Cole said, cutting him off. "You got scared. Things got out of hand. Just tell us what happened. We can help you." Rhodes placed a soda can on the table. "You want something to drink? You're not under arrest. We just need the truth." That last sentence always came before the storm. The camera in the room blinked red. Recording. The time, 12:03 a.m. Jamal hadn't called his mom. No lawyer was present. No adult advocate. The detectives knew the law allowed questioning of minors without a parent in some cases, and they pushed every limit. For 2 hours, they wore him down. Told him they had evidence. Told him a witness saw him. Told him he could go home if he just said he did it. Jamal's voice broke. He swore he didn't hurt anyone. Then they showed him a photo of Hector Morales, dead. Something inside him cracked. Tears spilled down his face. He covered his mouth. And in a whisper, he said the words that would change his life. "Okay? I did it." It made no sense. Jamal couldn't describe the murder weapon. He got details wrong. He said he stabbed Hector twice, when the autopsy showed a single wound. He claimed he ran out the front door. Security footage showed someone fleeing through the back. But the detectives didn't care. They had a confession. And that was all they needed. The next morning, The town woke to a headline that sent shockwaves. Teen arrested in murder of local shop owner. Police credit swift work and community safety. Jamal's mugshot, eyes puffy, cheeks stained with tears, was plastered across news channels and Facebook pages. No one talked about his stutter. No one asked why a 16-year-old had no lawyer during questioning. No one questioned how he could have done it with no motive, no weapon, no blood on his clothes. They had a suspect. They had a confession. Case closed. But the truth? The truth was just getting started. The room was cold. Too cold for someone barely old enough to drive. Jamal Evans sat on the edge of the steel chair, his hands folded tight in his lap, as if he were trying to hold himself together. The gray walls seemed to close in. There was no clock, no window, and no sense of time. Only the fluorescent hum above and the slow blinking of the camera in the corner. It had been hours since he was brought in. No food. No water. No phone call. Just questions, relentless, circling, sharp as knives. Detective Cole had been leading the charge. "You were there, Jamal. We know you were," he said, his tone low, calm, rehearsed. "You can either be smart or you can be stubborn." Jamal shook his head. I didn't do anything. You were at the store. That's not a question. Your phone was there. Your prints. You were there." "I dropped my phone," Jamal stuttered. I heard someone." "You heard someone? Then why didn't you call for help?" "I tried," he whispered. "I dropped it." Cole slammed a folder on the table. Inside were crime scene photos. Blood. A knife. Hector Morales' lifeless face. Jamal flinched. "Look at him, Jamal. You did this. You got scared, we get that. You didn't mean for it to happen. But the truth has to come out." "I didn't," Jamal's voice cracked. Why won't you believe me?" Detective Rhodes finally spoke, his voice quieter, more measured. "We do believe you, Jamal. We just think you're not telling the whole truth yet. Maybe someone made you do it. Maybe it was an accident. But if you tell us what happened, we can help you." They were trained to do this, one good cop, one bad. Pressure and relief. Fear and comfort. It was psychological warfare, and Jamal didn't even know he was on a battlefield. They leaned on him. Again. And again. And again. Somewhere across town, Jamal's mother, Danielle Evans, was pacing in her living room. Her phone calls to the station had gone unanswered. She hadn't seen her son since the night before. When she finally got through, the officer on duty told her, "He's being held for questioning. You'll be contacted if charges are filed." She dropped the phone. Danielle was a single mom working 2 jobs to keep the lights on. She had raised Jamal to be kind, respectful, cautious. She knew he'd never hurt anyone. But in Alder Creek, that didn't always matter. The rules were different when you were a black boy in the wrong place at the wrong time. Back in the interrogation room. "Let's run it back," Cole said, pacing now. "You left practice. Walked by the store. Then what?" I heard something inside," Jamal said. "A loud noise. Like a shelf fell or something. Then I saw someone run out." "What did he look like?" "I don't know. Tall. Hoodie." "You sure you weren't looking in a mirror?" Jamal's eyes welled up. Cole leaned in close, voice dropping to a whisper. "You're not leaving this room until we get the truth. And if you keep lying, it's gonna be worse for you." He pulled out a sheet of paper. "Write it down. Start with, I, Jamal Evans, confess to." "I didn't do it." Jamal cried. Cole stood back. "You're done playing the victim, kid." He turned to Rhodes and muttered, "Let's give him a few minutes alone." The door slammed shut. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. Jamal didn't know anymore. The lights felt hotter now. His hands were sweaty. His breath was shallow. He kept hearing the same sentence over and over in his mind, "You're not leaving until we get the truth." And so, broken, scared, and exhausted, he wrote the confession. He said he walked into the store. Said Hector Morales startled him. That there was a struggle. that he grabbed a knife, that he didn't mean to do it. None of it was true. But he thought that if he wrote it, if he gave them what they wanted, they'd let him go home. Instead, they cuffed him. And at 4:11 a.m., Jamal Evans was formally charged with second-degree murder. The booking process was cold and fast. Mugshot. Fingerprints. Holding cell. They didn't let him call his mother until after sunrise. When Danielle answered the phone, Jamal's voice was so low she could barely hear him. "Mama. I didn't do it." "I know, baby," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I know." Across town, a grainy surveillance camera at a gas station a block from Morales Market had captured a figure running into the woods just minutes after the alarm was triggered. The timestamp, 10:48 p.m. The same time Jamal was being handcuffed in the alley. But that footage? It wouldn't be discovered for another 3 weeks. And by then, the lie had already taken root. News spreads fast in small towns. Rumors spread even faster. By the time the sun rose over Alder Creek, the headlines had already framed the story. The media didn't say alleged. They didn't say investigation ongoing. They said, teen confesses to murdering local store owner. Community mourns beloved shopkeeper, suspect in custody. They printed Jamal's full name. His photo. His age. His school. His face, sad, puffy-eyed, confused, was posted on every Facebook feed, every gas station counter, every grocery store wall with headlines designed to enrage. The town didn't see a scared kid who had been pressured for hours. They saw a monster. At Alder Creek High School. When students walked into the school building that Monday, they walked past armed guards. Not for safety, just for show. Some kids whispered. Others pointed. A few wrote killer across a locker in red Sharpie. A teacher was overheard saying, "He always seemed quiet." That's the scary kind. The guidance counselor removed Jamal's name from the fall honors list. No one talked about his GPA. No one talked about his stutter. No one talked about his dreams of going to college for architecture. They just erased him. Within 24 hours, a Facebook group called Justice for Hector Morales had over 3,000 members. People demanded the death penalty. Others said he should rot in jail. Someone posted a photoshopped image of Jamal behind bars with devil horns and the caption, "Lock up the thug." Danielle Evans saw it all. She wanted to scream. To fight. To tear down every post, every comment, every lie. But she couldn't even afford a lawyer. Meanwhile, the real killer slept peacefully. He watched the news from a cheap motel just outside town. Hood up. Face hidden. A deep scar on his right wrist, a scar Jamal didn't have. He sipped his coffee and smiled. They got the wrong guy. And that meant he was safe. For now. In jail. Jamal sat on a thin cot in the juvenile wing of the county jail. The room smelled of bleach and despair. He hadn't eaten. Couldn't sleep. He kept replaying that night over and over, the scream, the man in the hoodie, the moment he dropped his phone. He remembered the way the detectives looked at him, not with suspicion, but with certainty. Like they'd made up their minds before the questions even started. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Hector Morales' face. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the dark. After calling every public defender's office in the state, Danielle was finally directed to Trina Walsh, a young, relentless defense attorney known for taking cases others wouldn't touch. Trina was sharp, black, and deeply aware of how the system treated boys like Jamal. She drove 3 hours from her office to meet Danielle at the jail. "I don't care what he confessed to," she said. "I've read the report. None of it adds up. I've seen this before, young kid, wrong skin, pressured into saying what they want to hear. Can you help him?" Danielle asked, eyes full of fear. Trina nodded. "I'm not going to let them bury your son." Trina immediately requested the interrogation tapes. But the footage had technical issues, the police claimed. The audio cut out for large portions of the confession. There was no video of the full 2-hour questioning session before Jamal was told his rights. It was already starting to smell like a setup. Trina dug deeper. She requested the crime scene report, the autopsy, and, most importantly, the store's security footage. When she got the tapes, she watched them again and again. And there it was, barely a second of footage from the corner of the back door, a tall man in a hoodie running away from the scene. Not Jamal. The killer was still out there. Trina Walsh sat at the edge of her cramped desk, the case file spread out like a battlefield map. It wasn't just a job anymore. This had become personal. She'd seen too many young black boys chewed up by the justice system. Some who'd done nothing at all, others whose biggest crime was being poor, scared, or in the wrong neighborhood. But Jamal? He was different. His confession was shaky. The timeline had holes. The evidence was circumstantial at best. And that shadowy figure in the security footage, the one detectives failed to mention in the report, was her crack in the armor. Trina had found her opening. When Trina walked into the holding room, Jamal looked up, his eyes hollow. "I'm not crazy, right?" he whispered. "I didn't imagine what I saw." "You're not crazy," Trina said gently. "You told the truth that night. And I believe you." Jamal's lip trembled. "They said if I didn't confess, I'd never go home." "They lied." He looked down at his hands. "Am I going to jail forever?" Trina paused. "Not if I can help it. But it's going to be a fight." And she meant every word. Trina launched a full-scale defense investigation. She subpoenaed every minute of store surveillance. She visited the gas station down the street, and found the missing footage the police had ignored. She filed a motion for the full interrogation logs, and uncovered that Jamal had been questioned without a guardian or lawyer present. She requested DNA analysis on the murder weapon, and it came back with two profiles. One was Hector's. The other wasn't Jamal's. That should have been enough to pause the case. But the DA wasn't backing down. Half of Alder Creek saw Jamal as a killer. The other half began to wonder if they were watching a cover-up unfold in real time. Protests began to form outside the courthouse. Some held signs that read, "Justice for Hector." Others held signs that said, "Free Jamal." Lines were being drawn. Neighbors stopped talking to each other. Friendships ended. The town was splitting in two. And still, the real killer walked free. His name was Darren Knox, a drifter with a long record: robbery, assault, petty theft. He'd slipped in and out of Alder Creek for years, blending in with the shadows. He didn't mean to kill Hector Morales. He just wanted the cash drawer. But Hector had fought back. And the knife he carried for protection had ended up stained with blood. Darren had seen the cops swarm the block. He'd seen the boy, Jamal, standing in the alley. And he'd slipped away like smoke. The system made it easy for him. Because Jamal was a more convenient story. Back in court, Trina stood before the judge, her voice calm but fierce. "Your Honor, we have video evidence that contradicts the confession. DNA that doesn't match my client. A coerced statement. And a clear violation of his rights." The judge adjusted his glasses. "And yet, your client admitted to the crime." He admitted under pressure. After hours of being isolated. Lied to. Threatened. That is not justice. That is psychological abuse. The DA scowled but said nothing. The judge agreed to a pre-trial evidentiary hearing. It wasn't a victory. But it was a chance. Enough for Trina to put the real story on the record. Enough for the press to start asking questions. Enough for the public to shift, if only slightly. And in a side room, as Jamal's shackles were being removed for the hearing, he whispered, "Thank you, for not giving up." Trina gave him a small smile. "I don't lose kids like you. Not without a damn fight." The courtroom was packed. Local reporters filed into the back row. Hector Morales' family sat on the left, eyes cold with grief. On the right, Danielle Evans clutched her purse with trembling hands as Jamal was led into the room in shackles. He looked smaller than ever in that oversized jumpsuit. But at the defense table sat Trina Walsh, fire in her eyes and a mountain of evidence in her briefcase. This wasn't just a hearing. This was war. "Your Honor," she began, stepping forward, "what happened to Jamal Evans is not just a miscarriage of justice. It is a blueprint of systemic failure. My client was interrogated without a lawyer, without his mother, and without a shred of physical evidence connecting him to the crime. She held up a DVD. This footage was retrieved from a neighboring gas station. Police never collected it. But we did. You're about to see what they didn't want you to see. She turned to the screen. A grainy black and white video played. Timestamp, the night of Hector Morales' murder. A tall man in a hoodie sprinted from the alley behind Hector's shop. His height. His gait. His build. It didn't match Jamal. Not even close. People leaned forward in their seats. The judge peered over his glasses. Trina kept going. Jamal didn't run. He stayed. He called 911. The first thing he did was ask for help. She pointed at Jamal. That's not the behavior of a murderer. That's the behavior of a scared, traumatized boy who just witnessed something horrific. The prosecutor objected. Your Honor, this is circumstantial. Is it? Trina countered. Because the murder weapon had DNA that didn't match Jamal. And we found a partial fingerprint on the handle, also not his. She dropped the final bomb. And the police didn't run those prints through the national database. So we did. She pulled out a report. It matches Darren Knox. A man with a long history of violent crime, recently released from a state facility 2 counties over. Silence. Then murmurs. Then outrage. Judge Carlton, a man known for being conservative and stern, adjusted his robe. I will be reviewing all this evidence carefully. But I must say, the defense has raised significant questions about the reliability of the confession and the integrity of the investigation. The DA shifted uncomfortably. I am ordering Jamal Evans be released from juvenile detention immediately, pending further investigation. As the gavel fell, Danielle Evans sobbed uncontrollably. She hadn't cried this hard since the night Jamal was taken. She wrapped her arms around her son as officers unshackled him. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. Jamal didn't speak. He just held her, his hands trembling, as if the ground beneath him still wasn't real. Jamal walked out of the courthouse that day a free boy. But he wasn't the same. He kept to himself. Flinched when people raised their voices. Couldn't sleep without nightmares of cold rooms and blinding lights. And though he was free, the whispers still followed him down the hallways of Alder Creek High. Still, Trina wasn't finished. She was just getting started. Darren had seen the hearing coverage. He knew the walls were closing in. He changed motels. Changed burner phones. But the truth had a way of catching up, faster than he expected. Because Trina had already handed everything over to a private investigator. And that investigator had tracked down Darren's last known alias. It was only a matter of time now. And Darren Knox had just made a mistake. He called someone. From a gas station. And the line was tapped. 3 days after Jamal's release, the pressure was on. Local media had picked up the story. National outlets started circling. Alder Creek was suddenly the face of everything wrong with the justice system, a small town with a big secret. And now, thanks to Trina's relentless digging, the name Darren Knox was in every reporter's notes. The manhunt had begun. It was a late-night call from a payphone outside a rundown gas station in rural Oregon. Darren was desperate. He needed cash, a place to lay low, and someone who wouldn't ask questions. He called an old girlfriend, Tasha, someone he hadn't spoken to in over a year. What he didn't know. Tasha's number was flagged. Trina had tracked every person connected to Darren's parole records, and her team had set up quiet surveillance on known associates. The call lasted 48 seconds. Enough for law enforcement to trace it to the station. By the time Darren hung up, a multi-agency task force had mobilized. When Trina got the call from her private investigator, she was already sitting with Jamal and Danielle, walking them through what came next. Listen carefully, she said. They're closing in on Darren. But if they catch him, this will all go public. Everything will be in the news again. Are you ready for that? Jamal didn't speak right away. Then he looked up. If they catch him, maybe people will finally stop looking at me like I'm the monster. Danielle reached over, squeezing his hand. We're with you. Whatever happens next. It happened in a flash. A SWAT team closed in on a dingy roadside motel 2 towns north of the Oregon border. Room 7. The door burst open just before sunrise. Darren tried to run. Didn't get far. He was tackled in the parking lot, his hoodie half torn, a knife in his back pocket. The same type used in Hector Morales' murder. Inside his room, a stolen wallet, a burner phone, and a blood-stained sweatshirt shoved under the mattress, Hector's blood, confirmed by DNA within 48 hours. Breaking, actual killer in Alder Creek case arrested, teen wrongfully accused. The headlines flipped overnight. Pundits who once called Jamal a menace were now questioning police methods. Civil rights advocates flooded into the town. The mayor gave a weak public apology. The police chief went silent. And Alder Creek High School? They held a moment of silence for Jamal this time. But he didn't attend. He didn't want their pity. He wanted his peace. With Darren in custody and physical evidence piling up, Trina filed a formal request. All charges against Jamal Evans, dismissed. Expunged. Public apology issued. She didn't stop there. She filed a civil suit against the Alder Creek Police Department for unlawful interrogation, coercion, racial profiling, and wrongful detention of a minor. It wouldn't fix the trauma Jamal endured. But it would make sure someone paid attention. And maybe, just maybe, it would stop the next Jamal from being locked up for a crime he didn't commit. Back in his room, surrounded by books, posters, and a bed that didn't smell like bleach, Jamal sat quietly, sketching in his notebook. Not monsters. Not shadows. This time, he drew buildings. Bridges. Freedom. The door creaked open. Danielle stood there, holding a plate of his favorite food. Thought you might be hungry. He smiled faintly. Thanks, Mom. She walked in slowly, brushing a hand over his shoulder. Whatever they took from you, we'll get it back. Jamal nodded, voice barely above a whisper. I just want to live again. The courtroom looked different this time. Jamal wasn't the one in handcuffs. He wasn't the one sitting behind bulletproof glass or being guarded by deputies. Now, it was the Alder Creek Police Department under scrutiny. Their procedures. Their choices. Their lies. This was Trina Walsh's arena now, and she intended to expose every inch of the rot. Trina stood at the podium, her voice clear and cutting. This case is not just about a wrongful arrest. It is about a system designed to assume guilt before truth, especially when the suspect is young and black. She clicked a remote, projecting a timeline. At 8:52 p.m., Hector Morales is attacked. At 9:03 p.m., Jamal calls 911. At 9:10 p.m., police arrive, Jamal is handcuffed. At 10:15 p.m., Jamal is interrogated without legal counsel. 12:40 a.m., Jamal confesses under duress. No lawyer. No parent. No forensic match. Just a terrified boy and officers who needed a story that fit. Gasps echoed through the room. Trina grilled Officer Daniels, the lead detective. You told the press Jamal confessed voluntarily. Is that correct? Yes. And yet, this video shows your partner telling him, quote, if you don't admit it, you'll never go home. Do you consider that voluntary? Officer Daniels hesitated. He could have asked for a lawyer. He was 14. Trina turned to the jury. This isn't about a mistake. It's about a pattern. One that costs lives. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered daily. Some held signs. Jamal deserves justice. We are all Jamal. End coerced confessions now. The mayor tried to save face in interviews, but the damage was done. Civil rights lawyers from around the state joined Trina's cause. One called it the most egregious failure of juvenile justice in the last decade. News vans camped outside. A documentary crew began filming. And inside Jamal's home, the phone rang non-stop. Colleges offering scholarships. Organizations wanting him to speak. Media outlets chasing interviews. But Jamal only agreed to one. A taped conversation with no cameras, just audio. I didn't think anyone would believe me, Jamal said, voice low. When they put me in that room, it was like the world stopped. I was a number. Not a person. The interviewer asked what scared him most. He paused. That I'd disappear. That I'd grow up behind bars and nobody would remember I was even a kid. Halfway through the trial, the city offered Trina a deal. $3.2 million. A public apology. And a commitment to retrain the police force. Danielle blinked at the number. Jamal looked to Trina. What do you think? I think money helps, she said. But policy changes protect the next kid. So she countered. She demanded not only the money and apology, but mandatory recording of all juvenile interrogations, body cams required during all arrests, and disciplinary action for the officers involved. They folded. The final verdict. 3 weeks later, the judge signed off. Jamal's name was cleared. Officer Daniels and 2 others were suspended indefinitely. The city passed a reform bill bearing Jamal's name, the Evans Accountability Act. For the first time, Jamal stood behind a podium, not as a defendant, but as a survivor. He read from a handwritten note. I'm not here to talk about hate. I'm here to talk about healing. What happened to me was wrong. But I forgive the people who failed me. I just hope they learn to never fail anyone else. The crowd rose to its feet. And somewhere in the back, Trina fought tears. The air felt different now. Jamal Evans had been through hell and back, but there was something unmistakable about the way the world seemed to open up for him after the trial. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He wasn't just a boy who had been wronged, he was a voice. A beacon for everyone who had been overlooked, ignored, or silenced. It wasn't long before Jamal was invited to speak at rallies, community meetings, and even law school classrooms. People wanted to hear his story. They wanted to understand how a system built to protect them had nearly destroyed a child. He was reluctant at first. Too many cameras. Too many eyes. But then, one afternoon, Danielle sat with him and shared a simple truth. Jamal, the world needs to hear you. Your story is theirs, too. And you have a chance to make sure it never happens again. That evening, Jamal made his first public speech. He wasn't standing at a podium, he was sitting in front of a small group of teens who had been caught up in the system. I used to think I had to keep my head down. That if I just stayed quiet, it wouldn't hurt. But I was wrong. If you stay quiet, people forget about you. His voice trembled, but he spoke with more passion than he ever knew he had. The only way to stop this from happening again is to speak up. To make sure our voices count. Trina, who had been a driving force behind Jamal's journey, suggested something radical. A documentary. Not just about Jamal's case, but about the larger issue of juvenile justice. What was really going on behind the closed doors of interrogation rooms? What happened when the system failed? With the blessing of Jamal and his family, the project was greenlit. Jamal spent the next few months working closely with the filmmakers, interviewing people who had been in his shoes. The faces on the screen were all too familiar, youths who had been wrongfully accused, coerced into confessions, or locked away without the resources they needed. One by one, they shared their stories. Jamal's heart ached for them. Some had been released after years of wrongful imprisonment. Others were still fighting for their day in court. But something was shifting. The world was watching. They were listening. And Jamal had become the voice they never thought they'd find. As the documentary aired, the response was immediate. Calls flooded into Trina's office from politicians, activists, and public figures. People demanded change. Jamal's journey had ignited a fire. It wasn't just about getting a settlement or an apology anymore. It was about real change, the kind that would protect the next Jamal, the next child who found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. 1 year after the trial, Trina presented a bill to Congress. The Jamal Evans Juvenile Justice Reform Act was born from Jamal's story, from the voices of those who had suffered in silence for too long. The bill called for automatic representation for juveniles during interrogations. Body cameras required for all law enforcement interactions with minors. Independent oversight of juvenile detention centers. Mandatory psychological evaluations for all suspects under the age of 18. The country's media erupted in support. But there were opponents, too, those who believed the system was fine the way it was. The debate raged for months. Jamal sat in the gallery, holding his mother's hand as the final vote was cast. The room held its breath. The Senate had already voted in favor of the bill, but the House was still uncertain. They needed one final push. The Speaker of the House stepped forward and called for the vote. When the result flashed on the screen, pass, the crowd erupted. The bill had passed. It was more than just a victory for Jamal. It was a victory for all the children who had been overlooked. For the families whose voices had been drowned out by a broken system. Jamal became the face of juvenile justice reform, speaking across the country and even testifying before Congress on behalf of young people who didn't have the platform he did. And the media, once critical of him, now painted him as a hero. They marveled at his strength, his resilience, and the way he had turned his pain into a source of power for change. But Jamal never saw himself as a hero. He was just a kid who survived. And he knew that his work wasn't done yet. Years later, Jamal sat at his desk, looking at the stack of letters that had accumulated over time. Letters from kids who had been wronged. Letters from parents begging for help. Jamal had turned the pain of his past into something powerful, a movement. He picked up a letter from a young girl named Maya, who had been wrongfully accused of stealing a car. Her words were simple, but they echoed in Jamal's heart. "I don't want to be afraid anymore. I want to be free like you." Jamal closed his eyes, remembering the years spent in fear. And then, a new determination washed over him. He wasn't just fighting for the people in the past anymore. He was fighting for those who would come after him. For Maya and for every child who deserved a future. And that fight? It had only just begun. Jamal Evans had never imagined that his story would ripple out this far, this fast. Once a kid forced to fight for his life in a system that had failed him, now he was a symbol of reform, a catalyst for the movement that would change the future for hundreds, if not thousands, of kids just like him. But despite the accolades, the awards, and the media attention, Jamal remained focused on what mattered most. The work wasn't done yet. After the success of the Jamal Evans Juvenile Justice Reform Act, Jamal was invited to speak at schools, juvenile detention centers, and even international forums on juvenile justice. The tours were grueling. There were late nights. There were hours of preparation. There were moments of exhaustion where Jamal questioned whether he could keep going. But then, standing in front of a group of young people who had faced similar hardships, Jamal would look out over their faces. He saw himself in them. That was all the motivation he needed. He shared his story with raw honesty. "I wasn't born into this fight. It was forced on me. But I made a choice, and that choice is the same one I want to give you. Your voice matters." The Evans Act became a template for reform across the nation. Several states adopted their own versions of the bill, expanding protections for juveniles and requiring systemic changes in law enforcement procedures. Schools started teaching children their rights. Police departments adopted new training protocols. Interrogation rooms were equipped with cameras. But perhaps the biggest victory was the creation of youth justice advocacy centers in every state, non-profit organizations that provided free legal representation for minors and helped prevent coerced confessions. Trina, who had stood by Jamal since day one, helped secure funding and oversaw the opening of the first center. She became a leading advocate for juvenile justice reform, ensuring that Jamal's work would live on. Some of the officers involved in Jamal's wrongful arrest were still working in law enforcement. But their involvement in Jamal's case had sparked introspection. Officer Daniels, who had once been a staunch believer in the guilty until proven innocent mentality, took a leave of absence to attend a rehabilitation program for law enforcement officers involved in racial profiling and misconduct. Jamal didn't know it at the time, but months later, Officer Daniels reached out to him. The letter was long, and its words heavy. "I was wrong. I knew I was wrong when I saw you, a scared kid, sitting in that interrogation room. But I didn't know how to fix it. I was part of the system. But I'm not anymore. I'm sorry. I'll be better." Jamal read the letter more than once. The anger he had once felt began to fade. Forgiveness wasn't for them. It was for him. He wrote back, "You're right about one thing, the system is broken. But we can't just fix the bad parts. We have to build something new. Thank you for starting to see that. Keep learning, keep growing, and maybe we can make sure it never happens again." 6 months after the reform bill passed, Jamal received an unexpected call. The White House wanted him to meet with President Sanders. The meeting was brief but impactful. President Sanders had been watching Jamal's work, following his efforts to expand juvenile justice reform, and wanted to know what came next. What more could the government do to improve the system? "I want to give every child a chance," Jamal said, looking at the president directly. "But it starts with people like you, who are willing to take responsibility for what happened. Acknowledging the problem is the first step. But it's just a start." President Sanders nodded, making a note. The conversation would help shape a new round of legislation, this time, expanding mental health services for juvenile offenders and making sure that juveniles weren't locked away without support systems in place. Back home, Jamal continued to rebuild his relationship with his family. The trauma of the past didn't vanish, but every step forward was a victory. Danielle, always his rock, started her own nonprofit, providing legal services for families of children in the criminal justice system. She worked tirelessly to ensure that no other mother would have to face what she did. Their family had been torn apart, but it was slowly being mended. And Jamal? He was finding peace, through activism, through his work, and most importantly, through the forgiveness that allowed him to finally start healing. One evening, Jamal sat at his desk, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He ran his fingers over a framed photo of his younger self, taken the day he was released from jail. That was the day everything changed. Now, as he stood before a new generation of young people, he wasn't just sharing his story. He was giving them the tools to take control of their own, to rise above their circumstances. "I'm not a symbol," Jamal would tell the kids in his talks. "I'm just a person who survived. You can survive too." The crowd always responded with the same question. "How do we change the system?" Jamal would smile. "You start by using your voice. Then, you keep speaking until the world has no choice but to listen." The fight wasn't over. Jamal Evans had always known this truth deep down. While the laws were changing, while reforms were being implemented, there was still so much left to do. The work, the struggle, it was ongoing, and it would never stop. The road ahead stretched endlessly, a path of both triumph and challenge. The weight of leadership. Jamal stood at the front of a crowded conference hall, his hand on the podium. He had just returned from a speaking engagement, where he had spent the past 2 days talking about the Jamal Evans Juvenile Justice Reform Act and the ripple effect it had created. Now, there was silence. Everyone was listening. Jamal had become more than just a survivor. He had become a leader, someone people looked to for answers. And while he wore that mantle with pride, it often weighed on him. He could see the next generation's faces, the kids who had so much to say, so much to give, but who had been ignored, just like he had once been. But the burden of leadership was heavy, especially when the problems were as deep-rooted as the ones Jamal was fighting. The fight for juvenile justice reform didn't stop with one piece of legislation. Jamal, Trina, and countless other advocates had learned this lesson quickly. While the Evans Act was groundbreaking, it was just the beginning. As Jamal pushed for reforms on a national level, he faced new obstacles. Not every state was as eager to embrace change. In some parts of the country, resistance was fierce. Jamal knew he had to keep going. "We've made progress," he would tell supporters, "but we're not finished. The fight for justice is always evolving. We need to keep pushing until the system is changed, from the inside out." One of Jamal's most effective tools in the fight for justice had always been his story. It was simple, direct, and painful, but it resonated with people. But Jamal knew that his story wasn't enough. He needed others to tell theirs too. That's why he worked alongside grassroots organizations to create the Voices of the Forgotten program, a platform for individuals who had been wronged by the system to share their stories. It was an effort to humanize the statistics, to put faces to the numbers. Every person who shared their story was a voice in a growing chorus that could no longer be ignored. As the years passed, more and more states began to adopt juvenile justice reforms. There were setbacks, families who fought for justice only to face roadblocks, communities where the system was slow to change. But the progress was undeniable. And all the while, Jamal remained at the forefront, using his platform to advocate for the voiceless. He traveled across the country, speaking at rallies and meeting with lawmakers. He worked with lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, urging them to understand the long-term consequences of a broken juvenile justice system. Jamal often found himself reflecting on the future. His work was not just for the present, but for the children who would never know the pain he'd endured. His efforts had given rise to a new generation of activists, attorneys, and educators who were committed to continuing the work. One day, after a particularly exhausting week, Jamal sat down with Danielle to talk about the next chapter in their lives. "It feels like we've come so far," Jamal said, rubbing his eyes. "But I can't help but wonder if we've done enough. I don't want to be remembered as the person who helped fix one problem. I want to be remembered as someone who helped spark an entire movement." Danielle smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You already have, Jamal. The road ahead isn't going to be easy, but you've laid the foundation. You've shown people what's possible when you fight for justice." Jamal nodded, feeling both exhausted and empowered. He had done his part, but the journey was far from over. As Jamal grew older, his perspective began to shift. He realized that while he had been an advocate and a fighter, the real change would come when the next generation took up the mantle. Jamal became more focused on mentoring young leaders, particularly those who had faced similar injustices. He invested his time in giving them the tools to lead, to speak, and to fight. And they, in turn, began to do incredible things. The young activists who Jamal mentored went on to pass more legislation, win more cases, and push for reforms in areas that had previously been ignored. They didn't just take his place, they built on his work, making it better, stronger, more inclusive. Jamal stood by them, proud of their accomplishments but always reminding them of the lesson he had learned long ago. Justice isn't a destination. It's a journey. And it never ends. Years later, Jamal stood once again in front of a crowd. This time, it wasn't just a conference. It was the grand opening of the Jamal Evans Juvenile Justice Advocacy Center in his hometown. The center would provide legal aid, counseling, and support to at-risk youth, helping them avoid the mistakes Jamal had made, and preventing them from facing the injustices he had. The ribbon was cut, and the crowd cheered. As Jamal stepped forward to speak, he looked out over the crowd and felt an overwhelming sense of peace. "We've come a long way," Jamal said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "But there's still so much to do. Let's keep fighting, for every child, for every voice that's been silenced." And with that, Jamal Evans's legacy lived on. A legacy built not just on one story, but on a movement. A movement that had begun with a single voice, and now, echoed across the world. If you enjoyed this episode of Chase Studio Stories, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us continue to share impactful and meaningful content.